This is the U.S. Report with James Morrow.
Good evening and welcome to the program. So much to get through tonight after a really big week. But we're going to have it all covered for you with a stellar lineup, so let's waste no time. Coming up tonight, Anthony Blinken arrives in Israel vowing that the United States will always be there as the war with Hamas intensifies. I'll be breaking down America's response to the crisis shortly. Also tonight, shameful stuff as the American media plays down Hamas butchery. We'll meet the terrorism truthers. Plus, John Fetterman gives us his insight into politics in Washington. Believe me, you're not going to want to miss what he's got to say about that. But first, I don't need to tell you that the past week in world events has been one of the worst weeks we have seen in this already ugly century. Some of the worst violence, perhaps the worst violence we have seen committed directly against the Jewish people since World War II. And now the prospect, potentially, of regional war in the Middle East, or worse, with all that entails. All this, sadly, you know already. But putting all this aside, I do need to share something else. That while responsibility for the violence of the past week lies squarely with the butchers of Hamas and their backers in Iran, we also need to take a good, hard, difficult look at how American fecklessness and failed foreign policy, particularly with regard to their treatment of Iran and Israel, have empowered the bad guys in Gaza and Tehran, while weakening the position of the good guys in Washington and Jerusalem. Yeah, I know, I said it. There's good guys and bad guys here, because this really is a battle between barbarism and civilization. And I'm sorry, it is very, very hard for me to take American foreign policy seriously at the moment, especially when this guy, Jake Sullivan, is National Security Advisor. Here he is less than 2 weeks ago.
What we said is we want to depressurize, de-escalate, and ultimately integrate the Middle East region. The war in Yemen is in its 19th month of truce. For now, the Iranian attacks against U.S. forces have stopped. Our presence in Iraq is stable. I emphasize for now because all of that can change. And the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades.
And how's that working out for you? Meanwhile, let's not forget that Hamas's backers, Iran, recently signed a deal to see $6 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars, in frozen assets giving back to them. Money which, despite the Hamas terrorist attack, a phrase which doesn't even begin to describe the level of psychotic evil we are talking about, the U.S. has not moved to claw back or block. This even though, as Secretary of State Anthony Blinken noted, Iran uses this money for terrorism.
What do you say about the argument that money is fungible? So Iran may have known this money is coming and used other funds to help fund this attack that happened.
Iran has unfortunately always used and focused its funds on supporting terrorism, on supporting groups like Hamas. And it's done that when there have been sanctions. It's done that when there haven't been sanctions. And it's always prioritized that.
So why not give them another $6 billion, honestly? And administration flack John Kirby also acknowledged that Hamas wouldn't exist without money from Iran.
Hamas wouldn't have been able to function at all had it not been for propping up by the Iranian regime. But we haven't seen any specific evidence that tells us they were witting, involved in the planning, or involved in the resourcing and the training that went into this very complex set of attacks over the weekend.
So Iran gives Hamas money, but Iran had nothing to do with the terrorist attack in Israel. I don't want to bring Maury Povich out here, but I think the lie detector would say that was a lie. And it gets worse, because under the Biden administration, Iran has been the recipient not just of that $6 billion deal, but as much as $50 billion in unfrozen assets from before the revolution, as well as from the removal of sanctions on things like the sale of oil. That $50 billion can buy a lot of bloodshed. So the question is, why? Why is America allowing this? Well, to get to the roots of this, let's have a little history lesson. And we have to understand what the Biden administration is all about, which is just a continuation of what the Obama administration was all about. Particularly, what we're talking about here is the so-called Iran deal, the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That was the bizarre program by the Obama administration that seemed, and still seems, designed with one goal in mind: empower Iran to become not just the funder of global terror networks such as Hezbollah, and a pariah theocracy that shoots people on sight for defying its orders about hijabs and much else besides, but also turn it into a regional player that controls much of Lebanon, with thousands of rockets aimed at Israel, and even potentially a nuclear power, with atomic weapons aimed at the Jewish state or anyone else who decides to get in Tehran's way. Now again, any reasonable person would ask why the U.S. has done this. Since 1979, Iran has been a pariah state, one that, for one of the first acts of its theocracy after the revolution, was to take a group of Americans hostage in the U.S. Embassy and hold them for 444 days. In the language of the Ayatollahs who took over Iran, the U.S. was the great Satan and Israel its little brother. So what's changed? Well, not that rhetoric, but what about Iran's leadership? Nah, that's still the same. The only thing that's changed here is America's leadership.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America.
Barack Obama wanted to fundamentally transform America, and fundamentally transform it he did, using Iran. Obama may have talked a politician's game about American exceptionalism, but the fact is that in his actions, he believed that America was not an exceptional nation at all, but a flawed one that needed, again, to be fundamentally transformed. And to transform America, Obama would have to see it taken down a peg. And by creating a multilateral post-Cold War world, that would mean the old United States wouldn't be there telling everyone what to do, or, for that matter, keeping them in line. It was and remains fundamentally a disaster, from the Arab Spring to the disaster in Libya to much else besides. But in the process, Israel, which has always had deep ties to the United States, in no small part because it too has an exceptional history and creed, also had to be downgraded. No longer would it be the nation's most important ally in the Middle East. Obama instead gave that role tacitly to Iran, which it sought to empower through that JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and even allowed to make money through a Hezbollah drug trafficking network. Now, of course, all this downgrading of Israel, the only democracy in the region, also empowered anti-Semitism and Hamas, which relies, as we have seen, on Iranian funding. Writing in Tablet magazine this week, Lee Smith made an excellent point. He said Obama's transformation of America was to remake it in his own image by junking the idea that America is exceptional and dissolving the country's borders with the rest of the world. America is not unique. It is as sinful as any other nation, he was effectively arguing, and possibly worse. What better way to make that point, he continued, than by throwing Israel overboard and replacing it with Iran, a country that preaches God's retribution against America. Now, Joe Biden, as I have repeatedly said on this program, is just finishing the work of the Obama administration. And I gotta say, isn't he just doing an amazing job of it? I want to get straight into the U.S. response to the crisis in the Middle East with my first guest, Michael Doran, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute. Michael, thanks so much for joining us on the U.S. Report. Let's get straight into it. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has landed in Israel and met with Benjamin Netanyahu. What message is he sending to the Israelis, and what does he want to achieve with this trip?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me. It's great to see you. He's there to express support for Israel and to, I think, help Israel prevent Hezbollah from opening a second front in the north. The nightmare scenario for the Israelis was kind of a 1-2 punch where Hamas would hit them in the south and then they'd get an uppercut from Hezbollah in the north. And I think the Americans, I think the Biden administration, you won't hear me say this very often, but I think they've done the right thing here, and they have they've moved significant naval assets into the Eastern Mediterranean in order to deter Hezbollah. And I think Blinken is there to monitor the situation, show support, and make sure that we don't have a wider regional war, which would be a disaster for the United States.
Well, absolutely it would be, and it's all, but I kind of feel like it's all very well and good that the U.S. is sending an aircraft carrier to the region. It's announced military supplies. But on the other hand, Michael, it seems kind of schizophrenic given that the U.S. has also empowered Iran so much under Joe Biden and Barack Obama before him. So, I mean, in a sense, they're trying to prevent somebody that they turned into a regional hegemon from acting like a regional hegemon.
Well, James, you've dragged me away from my supportive statements very quickly, and my ability to hold up this front of solidarity with the White House is quickly eroding. I agree with you 100%. It is schizophrenic. In addition to while I think they have done the right thing in supporting Israel against Hamas, their policy against Iran inadvertently, I don't think this was ever their goal, but it inadvertently incentivized and rewarded violence by Iran through proxies, especially Hamas and Hezbollah. And the policy is continuing to reward it by refusing to admit that Iran had a hand in this war, in these horrific attacks. Iran is the strategic enabler of Hamas. The ties between Hamas and Iran are so strong, so deep, so well understood. To say, which the administration is saying repeatedly now, that there's no evidence that Iran had anything to do directly to do with this attack is just ludicrous.
Yeah, I mean, that just seems, as you say, ludicrous here. We know that Hamas essentially wouldn't exist without Iran. Hezbollah, the same thing. So why won't the U.S. now do what seems like the logical step? Cut off Iran, say you're not getting that $6 billion back, put sanctions on the oil, and return Tehran to the pariah status that they enjoyed, if that's the word, before Barack Obama decided to start normalizing things with them through the JCPOA.
Well, this policy of engaging with Iran and trying to use the engagement to moderate the problems in the region is really deeply entrenched in their worldview. They strongly believe, they won't admit this openly, but they strongly believe that the Israeli and Saudi conflicts with Iran were forcing the United States to take extreme positions against Iran that were not in the American interest, and that if the United States would distance itself from its allies somewhat, reach out to Iran, show a willingness to come to an accommodation with Iran, that would reduce tensions throughout the region. You may have seen Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, recently had an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg that was a public interview with him, Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic magazine, in which Sullivan said basically that the policy of de-escalating and engagement and efforts to integrate the region were making it a much quieter place.
Yeah, no, we played a little bit of that earlier in the program, and it's just kind of shocking to me because especially when you look at it in the context of, say, Ukraine, and we're told, well, you can't appease Russia, you can't do anything to make a deal with them. We're also told, well, Iran, which has been since 1979, since the Iranian Revolution, a sworn enemy of the great Satan, the United States. Well, let's normalize, let's de-escalate, let's let them have a hand, let's let them dominate the region. Again, it feels like there's a bigger puzzle going on where America's enemies are seeing advantage in creating more chaos and getting rewarded for it. How does this happen, and what comes next?
Well, I think I think the analogy with Ukraine is pretty apt. They had a concept in their heads when they came into the White House that by returning Nord Stream 2, by lifting the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, that they were fostering economic cooperation between Germany and Russia, Nord Stream 2 being the gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, and that was going to, this was their word, park Putin. He was going to be happy with them, and that was going to allow them to focus on the real problem that is at the forefront of their mind, which is the military contest with China in the South China Sea. Similarly, in the Middle East, they told themselves that if they returned to the JCPOA and reached out to the Iranians, that would also kind of park the Iranians. They still haven't entirely left that mindset. Once they realized they couldn't get back to the JCPOA with the Iranians, now they've moved to a policy of quiet understandings under the table, behind the scenes. So a kind of a JCPOA light. And it's gonna take a crisis, I think, perhaps bigger than the one that we've seen here, to get them out of that mindset.
And finally, what does the United States need to do, the Biden administration, whoever's running the show in it, to prevent this conflict from turning into an even wider conflagration, one which may see China decide to try its hand in Taiwan and really turn this into a real sort of World War III type of situation?
All of the answers are in Tehran. The Tehran, that's the head office. Where this analysis that you and I have just developed, where this all leads is to the conclusion that the United States is supporting Israel in going after Iran's rabid dog, Hamas, but it won't support Israel in going after the owner of the rabid dog, who has 4 or 5 other rabid dogs in his hands. Until we go after the Iranians, this kind of thing is going to continue, and it's going to erode the American order in the region. When I say go after, it doesn't have to be a war. It doesn't have to be, a major military effort, but we have to set up an offense-dominant American regime in the region where Iran realizes that when it does things like when its proxies behave the way Hamas just behaved, that Iran will pay an unbearable price. And we've done just the opposite. We've told them that they can do this and get a free pass.
Michael Doran, thank you so much for your analysis. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Now from the war abroad to the war on the home front in America and how it's being treated by the media. To talk about this, I'm joined by U.S. Report regular Batya Ungar-Sargon, Deputy Opinion Editor at Newsweek. Batya, thanks so much for coming on the program this week. And first of all, I have to ask you, how are you and your family going during this horrific time?
Wow, thank you so much for asking that, James. By the grace of God, my family in Israel have been spared. But of course, everybody feels like family right now. This has been a very, very difficult week for the Jewish community globally, although of course the Israelis are the front lines of this, and not just Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, Israeli Druze. The butchers were indiscriminate in their murdering spree. So thank you very much for asking. We're holding it together and we're standing strong.
Oh, well, that's good to hear. And you're, of course, in New York City right now. And I've seen the police have now been ordered on duty, the entire force essentially, amidst a Hamas call for a global day of rage. What's the mood there in Manhattan, in New York City? And are the cops going to shut down any terrorist sympathizer protests? We've already seen a few little things flare up, but what's the vibe in New York now?
You know, we pride ourselves on our First Amendment here. We don't shut down protests unless they seem like they're going to get violent. The bar for meeting incitement is extremely high legally in America, I'm proud to say, as a very proud American. So I don't foresee them shutting down protests. The mood is the way that one of my friends phrased it was, on the one hand, we are not Jews of trembling knees. We are not afraid. This is our country, and we're not going to cower from these cowards. On the other hand, people with children are feeling very worried about sending them to school tomorrow. What do you do when there's a global assault, a threat on your children, on your people because of your ethnicity? So I would say we're sort of caught betwixt and between, on the one hand, standing strong, very proud, and not bowing and not giving in at all, but on the other hand, very much alert about the potential for something.
Yeah, and indeed, I've seen some terrible things, too, also out of Washington and some of the apologists almost for this butchery in Israel. And one of the worst things, I want to get your thoughts on this, was Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and she's a well-known critic of Israel, as we know. And here is some video of her refusing to condemn the senseless attacks on innocent civilians. Have a look at this, because I want to show our viewers this and get your reaction.
We can't comment about Hamas terrorists chopping off babies' heads. Congresswoman, do you have a comment on Hamas terrorists chopping off babies' heads?
I mean, imagine, Bachia, running from that question and not stopping and saying, this is some of the purest evil we've seen in a century.
It's unthinkable. It is unthinkable. The abdication of moral responsibility on the left is just horrific. But thankfully, James, what we're seeing is a level of just absolute rage at these congresswomen who are unable to simply stand up and condemn butchery like we haven't seen since the Nazis. There is on the left a huge outcry against this. They do not represent the Democratic Party. They do not represent even the left. This is a tiny, woke minority that has been exposed for having no morals whatsoever. And so that at least is a tiny silver lining, that people are seeing these people for who they are, moral cowards who cannot bring themselves to condemn the most heinous, vicious, disgusting assault on humanity.
And indeed, though, I have to stay on this Rashida Tlaib person, though, for a minute, because I just think she's so morally bankrupt. I found this clip from a couple of years ago when she was putting on the fake tears and the fake outrage about kids at the U.S.-Mexican border. Have a look at this.
Mr. Chairman, it needs to be noted into record. I spoke to CPB agents, even though they told us not to speak to them too. Remember that? And I said, what do you think we need to do, because you guys are overwhelmed?
Almost worthy of an Oscar there, but I mean, doesn't that just show you the kind of moral bankruptcy that we're dealing with?
You know, for some reason, and somebody not Jewish will have to explain to me why, when it comes to Jewish victims, it is impossible for the left to see them as victims. And so every time a member of the squad has said something about this for the last week, they have only been able to condemn Hamas in the context of also calling out either some Jewish protester or Israel for what it's doing to protect its citizens from terrorism. That equivocation between butchers who chop the heads off of babies, set babies on fire. Can you imagine the moral equivocation between that and the people trying to stop more of it? This is where their heads have gone. This is where their mentality is at. It is unforgivable, and we are not going to forgive it. And I don't just mean me, we, the Jewish people. I mean the left more generally has woken up from a stupor and is really calling this out as well. And that is heartening to see, James.
Well, and I have started to see some people, especially also within the sort of the progressive Jewish wing of politics, say that they've suddenly realized that, you know, they have a lot of people on the left who actually aren't their friends. And we're seeing this now, particularly with all of these calls for sort of restraint and so on by Israel. But, you know, in the face of what we've seen over the last week, it just seems like they're trying to draw terrible moral equivalence. Some people are.
Yeah, they really cannot understand the difference between the butchers and the people trying to stop more butchery. And I'll explain to you why, James. It's because in the woke mentality, you don't judge things based on right versus wrong. You judge them based on powerful versus powerless, and then you take race and you superimpose it. So the people of color are always powerless and thus virtuous, and the people who you consider to be white are the powerful and thus inherently evil and compromised. That is how the left for a long time has seen Israel. They code Israel as white, even though most of the Jews there are of Arab descent and look exactly like the Arabs who live in Israel. And thus they say Israel is the powerful one, and thus Israel has no right to defend itself against Hamas because they have slightly less power than Israel, which has a military. Therefore, they are the virtuous and they have to be on their sides. That is the mind virus called wokeness.
And Batya, there was a great example of this. The New York Times was caught out, and I thought this was something almost right out of 1984, you know, the changing of words, because they were caught out changing the language in one of their stories online, and you can go back and find it, and they went from calling them Hamas terrorists to Hamas gunmen. I mean, would this be an example of what you're talking about here, trying to basically sanitize this Hamas butchery?
Well, I have to a little bit defend them on the grounds that they might have a house style, and if that is the house style, then they have to adhere to it. But, you know, it's probably time to revisit that house style at this point. These are not militants. These are people who committed crimes against humanity of the level we haven't seen since the Nazis, and we have to be able to call that for what it is. The New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, be clowning themselves, going out of their way to create moral equivalency between Nazi butchers and people trying to stop those Nazi butchers from having their way again. And it's really time for us to be able to say, enough is enough. We said never again, and yet never again happened again right now.
Batya Ungar-Sargon, thank you so much for joining us at this horrible time. Stay safe and best wishes to your entire family. Thank you so much. Now, we've had a lot of serious stuff on tonight, and in a moment, Mick Mulvaney is going to break down how the crisis in Israel is playing out in the presidential race and some pretty controversial comments by Donald Trump. But before we go to the break, let's lighten things up a little bit with a little fun, Kamala Harris style. It seems the Vice President was in Charleston, South Carolina this week to talk about college kids and their fight for freedoms. And it turned out instead to be a fight between Kamala Harris and the English language.
I will tell you, I eat no for breakfast.
No for breakfast or just no breakfast? I don't know. That must be very confusing for the hotel staff. And also there was a fight between Kamala Harris and her inability to go 5 minutes without talking about Venn diagrams.
I'll tell you one of the things about me. So I'm kind of a nerd on certain levels about certain things. So here's one reveal. I love Venn diagrams. I love Venn diagrams. I'm telling you, whenever I'm facing like a conflict and I need to sort it out, give me a Venn diagram every day of the week, right?
She also loves the yellow school bus, but we'll talk about that some other time. Mick Mulvaney after the break. Welcome back to the program. In a moment, we'll be joined by Mick Mulvaney to talk us through how the conflict in Israel is impacting the U.S. presidential race and Donald Trump's controversial comments about Hezbollah. But first, we all know that sadly, in the United States, and Australia too, our institutes of higher learning are all too often bastions of deep stupidity and vile anti-Semitism. And we have seen that more than confirmed this past week, sadly. Take Harvard University, oldest university in the United States, one of the most prestigious schools in the world, and a place where maybe one would think people would know better, especially when the annual tuition fees top up around $75,000 a year. But it turns out that money doesn't necessarily buy brains, because soon after Hamas's brutal attack on Israel, a group of Harvard students thought it would be real clever to weigh in with their thoughts. Bad idea. because a letter signed by 33 student groups, well, they sought to address the crisis. And they said, today's events did not occur in a vacuum. And then they went downhill from there, saying that Israel had only itself to blame for the violence. Now, honestly, as if politics could ever deliberately justify murdering babies in cold blood in their beds, the students invoked all the usual tropes, of course, from Israel being an apartheid state to solidarity with the Gazans caught up in the fighting. But not a word about the Israelis on the other end, naturally. The university was mealy-mouthed, as you would expect, in its response too. So, in response, the conservative group Accuracy in Media decided to take matters into their own hands, driving trucks around Harvard Square displaying photos of the students linked to the statement, and their names too, and directing people to the website harvardhatesjews.com. Oh, and it gets better. Business executives across the country are putting out the call. If you're a Harvard student who signed that letter, we don't want to hire you. And, you know that I am against cancel culture. But according to the left, if you're associated with Nazis, you're a Nazi yourself. Sorry, guys, I don't make the rules. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Now let's take a deeper dive into the conflict in Israel and how it is impacting American politics, particularly that coming 2024 election. Joining me to discuss this is former White House Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor at Bondi Partners, Mick Mulvaney. Mick, first of all, thanks for coming on. And reactions to the crisis in Israel from leaders around the world are under the microscope. But Donald Trump is being criticized for his comments at a rally about Hezbollah. Have a listen to this.
Gee, I hope Hezbollah doesn't attack from the north, because that's the most vulnerable spot. I said, wait a minute. You know, Hezbollah is very smart. They're all very smart. The press doesn't like when they say it.
Now, some people are saying that this is a bad look for Donald Trump there to be talking about Hezbollah in those terms. How damaging is this? Is this getting a broader play than just sort of the confines of Twitter?
Yeah, James, it's always, impossible to predict when if Donald Trump will ever take that final step and just go a bridge too far and finally start turning people against him. I don't think this is going to do it, but he's pushing up against the envelope. In fact, in the last, 12 hours here, he's also come out saying critical things about President Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, which, again, is really, really pushing the envelope with his core base of supporters. Do I think it's going to change the outcome of a primary election? No. But Donald Trump really is sort of taking things as close as he possibly can to try and turn people against him. We'll see if it happens.
Well, Mick, this is an interesting thing that always happens in politics. When there's crisis, when there's a war, people generally wind up sort of coming back in the direction of the people in power if the people in power don't wind up screwing it up too badly. The Biden administration response has not been horrible to this. They've sent military assets to the region, and they've been saying all the right things. Is there a chance here that Joe Biden, or the Democrats rather, the Biden machine, could start to turn some of their fortunes around off the back of this?
Yeah, there's a chance. Keep in mind, in American politics, foreign policy very, very rarely determines any outcomes. I guess there was an exception maybe during the Vietnam War and maybe a little bit towards Afghanistan, but not much. So typically, foreign policy doesn't drive voters in this country. That being said, Joe Biden has been operating under this cloud ever since the pullout from Afghanistan over a year ago now, and rightly so, because it was badly, badly mismanaged. If he can manage this better, and he is managing it better, maybe he might be able to convince people that Afghanistan was not part of a pattern, it was the exception. So they've done a nice job here in the first 72 hours. You have to give them credit. Of course, actions will always speak louder than words, especially in international politics. So the next 2, 3, 4 weeks are going to be absolutely critical, not only for what's happening in Israel, but for what's happening in the Biden administration. But we'll wait and see. So far, Biden has done better in the last 72 hours than Trump has.
But at the same time, though, a lot of people are saying, and I think quite correctly, Mick, that the world has become a much more dangerous place under Joe Biden. We've seen all sorts of mayhem around the world since they took power. And we've also had this little detail that Biden was told about the war breaking out in Israel at 7 a.m. the morning after the news broke everywhere else, essentially suggesting that his team chose not to wake him up. People should be concerned about this, shouldn't they?
They should, and that has not received nearly enough attention here. I picked up on it as I watched his press conference. He said, when I woke up this morning, they told me right away. And I'm like, oh, my goodness, that means they didn't wake the president up. It's always a big issue in this country, especially during elections, James, about the 3 a.m. phone call. I think Hillary Clinton actually did a campaign ad about that when she ran.
Actually, Mick, let's have a quick, we'll have a look at that ad right here.
It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. But there's a phone in the White House and it's ringing. Something's happening in the world. Your vote will decide who answers that call. Whether it's someone who already knows the world's leaders, knows the military, someone tested and ready to lead in a dangerous world. It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. Who do you want answering the phone?
I'm Hillary Clinton, and I approve this message.
So there's that ad, Mick.
Yeah, so I mean, clearly Joe Biden wasn't awake for the 3 a.m. phone call, or better put, his staff chose not to make the call. That's not an accident, James. That doesn't happen sort of by mistake. There's no people running around the White House at 2 a.m. going, should we wake the president up or not? That was a decision that the National Security Advisor and the Chief of Staff made in advance, which is we are not going to wake the president up. You can expect to hear about that again and again and again in the 2024 campaign, regardless of who the Republican nominee is, because that is a major problem. The voters in the United States expect the president to lead in times of crisis, not to sleep.
And I'm glad you brought up the National Security Advisor, because this really does bring up a question that I've asked, and we've talked about a lot on this show, about who is really running the White House. Is this Jake Sullivan who's now actually running the whole response to Israel? And Biden is, again, as we've talked about in other circumstances, just a figurehead.
Yes and no. There's actually some indication now, just in the last couple of hours. In fact, I just saw some reporting out of Washington, D.C. before I turned on this computer, that President Biden actually rewrote a couple of the speeches that he gave in the last couple of days to make the language tougher. This is a more assertive president than I think we've seen in a long time, because typically he's not even capable of getting through a written statement without screwing it up too badly. But he does seem to be asserting himself here. That being said, I still come back to the fact that the Chief of Staff and the National Security Advisor are probably running the day to day, but it does look like Joe Biden is actually paying attention here in a way he has not on previous issues, for example, Afghanistan.
But there's also some other problems, too, behind the scenes, because along with all of the questions about why the Bidens have pumped all of that money back to Iran, not just the $6 billion from those seized assets, but lifting sanctions and a lot of other things as well, there's a lot of concern around the Biden administration's former special envoy to Iran, who was placed on leave earlier this year for mishandling classified material. People are saying that he had a permissive stance towards the Tehran regime, and this comes amidst also reports that there was a massive influence peddling operation in Washington by Iran. This almost feels sort of like the Cold War, when people were concerned that Moscow was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Is this kind of the same thing now, but with Tehran?
It's hard to say. There's certainly a lot of questions that are being asked. There's a lot of questions about connections between high-ranking members of the Biden administration and these pro-Palestinian groups are coming out in the last couple of days as well. I prefer to look, and I know you do, James, at the actions louder than words. What are the actions? Under the Trump administration, Iran was selling about 400,000 barrels of oil a day. Under the Biden administration, they're selling about 3 million barrels of oil a day. That's a lot of money that could go to things like funding terrorism. So look, the Biden administration has a lot of questions to answer. There's no question about it. One of the questions, by the way, we've not even talked about yet is, where were the American intelligence agencies? Why did we miss this as badly as it looks like we did? Who's running that organization in the Biden administration? A lot of really harsh questions here. Going to be a long time for know the answers, but this will bring nothing like a really nasty war with a good friend to bring these types of things into focus.
Mick, we're going to have to leave it there, but we've got a lot of questions to talk about next week as well, and I look forward to speaking to you then. Thank you so much for your time. But now, in a moment, we're going to talk to editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal, Gerard Baker, about the lessons America needs to learn about what happened over the past week or so. But before we do that, remember John Fetterman, the hoodie-wearing senator from Pennsylvania, who may be the dopiest legislator since Caligula put his horse in the Roman Senate? Well, even he's pretty cynical about politics and thinks the system needs to do better when it comes to, yeah, I know, the candidates who get sent to Washington. Check this out.
You all should need to know that America is not sending their best and brightest, to Washington, D.C. Yes. Like, sometimes you literally just can't believe, these people are making the decisions that are, determining the government here. It's actually scary.
Not sending their best, you say? Mate, do you own a mirror? Honestly. Gerard Baker after the break. Welcome back to the program. And the past week has not just been a tragedy for Israel, but a real shock to the global order as well, and America's place in it. Now, I'm very pleased to be joined now by Wall Street Journal editor-at-large Gerard Baker. You may have seen his columns in the Australian newspaper, and he's also the author of American Breakdown, which is all about the trust deficit in American society and how institutions, politicians, and ordinary citizens can work to get it back. Gerard, welcome to the program, and I'm sorry it can't be under happier circumstances, but I wanted to bring you on to ask you, first of all, about your latest writing about Hamas's barbaric attack and the New World disorder, you call it, under Biden. And you've said that we must understand the strategic context that demands an accounting of the role the U.S. has played in the genesis of this tragedy. Talk us through what you mean here.
Yeah, James. Well, first of all, thanks. Pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, look, I mean, the first thing to say, crystal clear, the responsibility for this absolute monstrosity lies solely with Hamas, with these bloodthirsty savages who've committed this just simply, I mean, an astonishing act of depravity that, just defies any kind of understanding of moral code or law or anything else whatsoever. So I want to be clear, that's where the blame lies. But it does need to be understood, of course, in the broader context of what's been going on in between Israel and the Palestinians, but also in the broader Middle East. And I think what worries me and what worries a lot of us over here, and I'm sure worries a lot of people in Australia too, is what we've seen in the last, frankly, not just in the Biden administration, although we can talk about what Biden's done, but over the last 2 decades, a series of American disasters in the Middle East. And, during the Cold War, the Middle East was to some extent a sort of a strategic battleground between the United States and the Soviet Union. And then after the Cold War, the United States was the power that dominated the world, dominated that region. And by and large, things, although there was never complete peace, there were always these outbreaks of violence. By and large, the U.S. presence there, the fact that the U.S. was this enormously important and engaged power, meant that it kept a lid on the sort of spiraling into chaos that was always at risk of happening. I think what we've seen, beginning with the disastrous war in Iraq, which was a disaster, one of the biggest calamities in American foreign policy history, the forces that unleashed, the power that gave to Iran. Then, of course, after Bush, you had Barack Obama, who went in exactly the opposite direction, chaotic, unfocused, completely disordered approach to the region, terrible mess he made in Libya, the terrible disaster in Syria, where the United States, first of all, threatened to intervene and then did nothing. And then now, of course, then you had Trump. Trump, I think, to be fair, and I'm not Trump's biggest fan, but Trump did manage to make some achievements in the Middle East with the Abraham Accords in particular, and at least restore the sense that the United States was actually a serious player in the Middle East. And then Biden came along and, frankly, just repeated the mistakes that Obama has made. So that has created this vacuum in the Middle East, absence of the United States, into which particularly Iran, other powers, but particularly Iran has emerged as one of the strongest powers. Yeah. And again, this is what's so frustrating is the Biden administration has been appeasing Iran and allowing Iran to cement its power in the region.
Well, that's a really interesting thing here, and I'm glad you brought up Iraq, too, because it seems like from almost 9/11, everything that the U.S. has done, either accidentally or by design, has been to empower Tehran, which, of course, since 1979, since the Iranian Revolution, has been the country that views the U.S. as the great Satan. What do you think about this theory, though, that the Biden administration is basically the third term of the Obama administration when it comes to foreign policy and has deliberately decided to use Iran to run its sort of agenda and also at the same time disempower Israel, which the Democrats, Obama, have a bunch of issues with in terms of America, that they want to kind of break that nexus between the two powers?
Yeah, I think it's broadly true that the Biden administration is a kind of continuation of sort of the interrupted Obama administration. Look, if you remember what Obama made his priority, literally his priority in the Middle East, getting a deal with Iran, getting the nuclear weapons deal, the so-called JCPOA, getting a nuclear weapons deal, which let's face it, what did it actually do? It supposedly extended the amount of time that Iran would be able to develop a nuclear weapon in exchange for really significant economic benefits, the lifting of sanctions, the ability of Iran to flood the world, to put its oil back on the world markets. It got that deal. Then obviously Trump came in, abrogated that deal immediately. And then, of course, Biden's come back in, has tried to get that deal back on track, but failed. But in the absence of getting that deal and giving Iran that restoring Iran's economic power, what they've tried to do is they've tried to do other deals with Iran. We've had that deal just a few weeks ago where they transferred $6 billion to Iran to be held actually, outside Iran, but in exchange for hostages. And again, they've been building up Iran. Now, again, I'm not suggesting here that there's some, although there are some very very, very interesting stories, as I'm sure you know, James, about the people inside the administration who've been working on Iran, in fact, how Iran has developed extraordinarily strong connection with people who've been working on Biden administration policy on Iran, and indeed Obama administration policy. But look, I think they have this misplaced idea that Iran, above all else, needs to be appeased. We need to find some way to just defer the moment which they get a nuclear weapon. That means they've downgraded Israel in their calculations. They've downgraded Israel seeking to achieve these agreements, the Abraham Accords, these agreements with Arab countries. And I'm afraid they've empowered Iran again. And Iran obviously is Hamas's paymasters. They have tremendous influence over Hamas. And I don't think there's any question that this terrible attack we've seen in Israel has been brought about partly because Iran has enabled Hamas to get the kind of weapons and also to reestablish its kind of reputation in the region. So it is a real flaw. We've had 20 years of failed American policy in the Middle East, and the Biden administration is kind of doubling down on it.
Gerard Baker, thank you so much. I'm going to have to leave it there, but read his stuff in The Australian and The Wall Street Journal and buy his book as well. Thank you so much, Gerard Baker. Now, don't go away because Only in America is next. But before that, let's lighten things up with a little bit of Joe versus the pre-prepared remarks.
And I want you to know that I want to thank you as well for all of you as well for working.
Yes, well, let's press on.
We mourn the act you and so many leaders have across the country.
So as you were saying...
But I just, look, I mean, I'll never forget, well, I won't go into that. Anyway,
Only in America is next. And now it's time for a little segment we like to call Only in America. Well, it's October in America and everywhere else for that matter, and that can only mean one thing. Pumpkins, Halloween, pumpkin spice lattes, and did I mention pumpkins? Really big ones too, especially in America, of course. Check out the moment this week when Travis Geinger won the Safeway World Championship Pumpkin Weigh-Off in Half Moon Bay, California.
Okay, I'm going to hit the switch right now. 2749! Oh my God, Half Moon Bay is in the record books. That's a world record! World record!
The Great Pumpkin Weigh-Off. Oh, is there such a thing? Well, we don't call this segment Only in America for nothing. That's all the time we have for now. See you next time. In the meantime, shalom and bye-bye.